Hi, and welcome to Visual. Well, let's try this again. Hi, welcome to Visual Studio Toolbox Live. Joining me today is our guest, Josh Johanning. How you doing?
Hey everyone. Hey Robert, how's it going?
Good. So yesterday you were on. This is 2 days in a row. So you and Leslie did a live show on DevOps with GitHub Actions. But there's a
Yes.
couple different ways to do DevOps. And today we're going to do DevOps with Azure Pipelines. And we can do a tiny bit of compare and contrast, but there's basically two ways to do it. Before we dive in, why don't you introduce yourself briefly? Who the heck are you?
Yeah. All right. Hey everyone. My name is Josh Johanning. Thanks for joining and thanks for watching if you're watching and recording. I'm a DevOps architect at GitHub and located in Madison, Wisconsin. So I work on the fast track team at GitHub. So we work with customers for a few weeks. So we see a little bit of everything. And what we're talking about today with Azure Pipelines, it's a very common scenario where you have a big investment into Azure DevOps still, but you maybe want to integrate with GitHub or you stay on Azure Pipelines or Azure DevOps. So yeah, that's what we're working with today.
So back in the old days, there were Azure DevOps services, and there's also Azure DevOps Server, and you could do your CI/CD pipelines, and then of course there was renamed Azure Pipelines, and then GitHub Actions came along, which kind of seemed to do the same thing, and there was a lot of concern that GitHub was the thing, and Azure DevOps was going to disappear. Did that ever happen?
Yeah. Well, since we're here, no, yeah, that's a good point. I think there was a little bit of fears that Azure DevOps would go away and just cease to exist, but that's clearly not the case, and still getting investments. Is it receiving as many investments as it maybe was like a few years ago? Probably not. GitHub is kind of where all the investments are going, but we still love all of our Azure DevOps friends, and there's no need to leave if you're still using it and you love the product.
It still works great, from what I hear.
Yes, exactly.
And you're going to show us that.
You
So
bet. You bet.
let's get to it.
All right, that's awesome, everyone. Let's do it. So, yes, I want to go through creating a pipeline in Azure Pipelines, and just how we talked about, you either create a GitHub action in GitHub, in GitHub, or Azure a pipeline in Azure DevOps. I'm going to show you a few different ways inside of Azure DevOps itself to create a pipeline. But first, let's take a quick step back. All right. So, what is Azure Pipelines? Maybe you're new and you're not using pipelines yet, but you're using Azure DevOps. So let's kind of just take a quick refresher. So I want to go through kind of what we're going to be building. There's two ways to build out your pipeline in Azure DevOps. What's referred to as the classic interface, where it's very GUI, kind of you drag and drops tasks in the order you want them. Very clean, very easy to use. So that's one way, and I'll show that way. So basically we change our code, push our code to the repo, and then all the pipeline bits are we created in the web, and we can optionally release that. So there's also releases inside of Azure Pipelines as well. That's kind of has that same classic interface, the GUI interface. There's also YAML, the YAML syntax, everyone's favorites language or editor, text editor. So with YAML, of course, spaces matter. So we have to make sure that we're indenting properly, or using two spaces to line everything up correctly. So it is a little bit maybe more challenging to get started, but it is more powerful. And just how we're kind of used to storing infrastructure as code, obviously our app as code, config as code. Now we're storing our pipelines as code so that we can have the same pull request and review process that we're familiar with our regular code, and now with our pipelines as well.
And YAML, as we saw yesterday, is what GitHub Actions uses exclusively.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So if you get familiar with YAML, or you have familiarity with YAML, and like you build your Azure pipeline in YAML, then it's a very seamless transition if you ever want to go use GitHub Actions one day.
Right.
Cool. All right. So basically, this is just a high level, another reference from the awesome Microsoft Docs. Just a high level of like maybe what you might be doing from start to finish with Azure Pipelines. So as a developer, you commit code to your Git repo. That Git repo could live in Azure DevOps or GitHub. We have if you create a pull request, it's going to run an Azure pipeline to validate that there's tests and lints and your build passes and things like that. Can optionally publish to Azure artifacts if you have like a NuGet or npm package. But then your Azure pipeline is going to run from a CI perspective, and build your code and publish the code so that the deploy step now in Azure pipelines can take that and publish that to anywhere, whether it's an IaaS website on-prem or an Azure app service in Azure, or a function app, or wherever. If you can script it, Azure pipelines, GitHub Actions can run it and deploy it.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So that's just a high level of the kind of where Azure pipelines fits in the overall CI/CD space, and just your overall lifecycle management in general. I want to dive into, now let's get into the nitty gritty. So let's actually start talking about Azure pipelines. What makes up an Azure pipelines? How can we configure it? What is some of the terminology that we should be familiar with? So let's do that. So cool. So yeah, our pipelines, we have a pipeline here. A pipeline is made up of stages. A stage is made up of jobs. And then the jobs then are made up of steps, which could be scripts or tasks from the kind of from like the marketplace, or from the just the built-in task list. And of course, our pipeline is triggered by events. So the most common trigger that we would use is when someone pushes to main, or potentially creates a pull request to main. We want that to trigger the start of the pipeline.
Okay.
As I'm going to show you, if you create a YAML pipeline, just from like some of the out of the box templates, some of these are optional though. So if you just have one job, then like stage and job are optional. So if you have something that's very simple, hey, I just want to build this and see if it works, you don't even need to define stages and jobs. You can just run everything as is, and then it just assumes one stage, one job. But that's probably that works for the most basic scenarios, or if you just automating something very simple. But kind of in the enterprise scenario where you have a build job, and then maybe a security scan job, and then okay, now we're deploying this separately and we want approvals and things like that. That's where we get into wanting to actually use and define stages and jobs in our YAML file.
Okay, makes sense.
Cool, awesome. All right, so yeah, that's enough terminology. And I'll be going through some more, of course, as we get going. But just wanted to cover the pipeline made up of stages and jobs. So excellent. So I'm going to go back to my Azure pipeline, or back to Azure DevOps. So of course, I'm in an organization, in a project, and my project has two existing pipelines for me to see. I could click on all to get a list of the two pipelines, and then the runs. So I could filter into the runs in particular. But otherwise, I'm going to create a new pipeline, of course, to get us going. But this is just the interface if you're not familiar with it. Otherwise, okay. I have a code base in GitHub, and I have a code base in Azure DevOps as well, with Azure repos. So you can have your code can live anywhere. It doesn't have to live in Azure DevOps, but it can. It can live in any Git provider. And GitHub is a great choice for that as well. All right, so let's create a new pipeline. Actually, first I'm going to show I do have a website published. So if you watched the video yesterday with going to GitHub Actions, we published a website. So the website's still there, it's still loading. I want to make some changes here to change the color of this background, this header background, from gray to not gray, because gray is kind of bland and boring. So I'm quickly going to make a change to do that. So I'm going to use it. I'm going to go into my GitHub repo and go. This is my code space for my GitHub repo, and just find the quick CSS change to change that. So just to prove that Azure Pipelines is making that update. So instead of 666 for the hex code for gray, let's just call it green or something, and make this change to green, commit, push. All right, cool. So we'll worry about deploying later, but no, our goal here is to be able to deploy this website to our Azure App Service. and so that the color changes from gray to green. All right, so now we don't have to worry about our in GitHub for now. So I'm going to go create a new pipeline in Azure Pipelines. So we'll notice right out of the gate, we'll see a few different things here. On where's your code? So again, your code can live in Azure DevOps, and that's probably going to be the case for a lot of folks who are using Azure DevOps. You have your work items live in Azure DevOps. Your code lives in Azure DevOps. Your pipelines Azure DevOps. Everything in Azure DevOps. But you can integrate with GitHub and any other Git provider as well. As long as you have network connectivity, it'll work. So I'm going to show both creating from the GitHub and Azure repos, but I want to start with GitHub because there is a couple different ways to configure the kind of how Azure DevOps and GitHub talk to each other. So I just want to it can be confusing at first because there's a couple different ways. So what the default method is, or what it's going through right now, is the OAuth method. So it's setting up my OAuth credential. So it'll see the repos that I have access to, and it'll show that on this next screen here for me to configure. So yeah, so this is the repo right here that I just pushed to. So I could click this and then configure and go on my way. I do want to go back a page though. That if we go to the bottom, scroll way to the bottom. All right, we can specify a specific connection if you're not seeing what you want or you want to use a different connection. So there are three ways. There's the OAuth credential, which essentially uses the OAuth, the credential of whoever clicked through it to access the repo in GitHub. You could use just a personal access token, and that works as well. You can create a personal access token and set up a service connection through that. Or like my favorite way is to use the GitHub Azure Pipelines app. So this is what this one is here. So if we go to Bing and search for Azure Pipelines GitHub app, it will the first result. So this is the app in the GitHub marketplace, and we can walk through the steps. I already have it configured, but we can walk through the steps to configure this, pick our organization, and then install that app in GitHub, and then it'll redirect you and have it connect to Azure Pipelines as well. So the app is the best way, but there are other ways to set it up. But you pretty much didn't really know or need to know how that works, but because if you just walk through the wizard, it would just use the OAuth credential. It even prompts you once you have your first pipeline created, hey, you might want to upgrade this to use the GitHub app, so you can very easily click the button and go. But so I want to mention that. Now let's talk about some of the other things we see here. So we have pick Azure repos, GitHub, and if I pick Azure repos for example and pick my only repo I have, we have a couple options on how to configure the pipeline. So it gives you some templates here to help you get started. So you could very simply start with the starter pipeline, or you could even import an existing YAML file.
Okay.
There are some other options here that we might be interested in, like taking our ASP.NET Core, for example, like it's very similar to our project. Take this and deploy, build this essentially. So if we click this, it'll take us right to our YAML file, and away we go. You might notice that this doesn't have a lot here for us. It's pretty much just a simple script task, and tells us to run our .NET commands. Very nice with .NET. You can just run your command. It's very simple to run a .NET build. But you might be more interested in the other method, the classic method, especially if you're a first time learning with pipelines. You can start with the classic pipeline and then kind of figure that out. And then there's even a way to export that classic pipeline as YAML. So let's start with the classic editor because it makes it a lot easier if you're getting started. You don't have to be an expert. All right, cool. So I'm gonna use classic editor, and I could pick where my source lives in Azure repos, Git or GitHub Git. So I could pick my credential here and use the org, and then type in the org name /repo, and the repo name was this, and then in main, so it picks it up there. So I could use that. Well, actually, yeah, let's do that then. But Azure repos would be the same exact thing.
Okay.
All right, cool. So a very similar kind of template interface for us to choose from here. .NET Desktop, ASP.NET. Even reminds you to, hey, maybe you're looking for YAML. Try that out. But let's try the ASP.NET Core app because it's very similar to, or this will work perfectly for our app here. Just very simple .NET build, .NET publish. All right, cool. So you'll notice this looks a lot different than YAML, and again, is a little bit more friendly to, especially if you're, if you haven't used the pipeline editor before, or kind of new to automation. It makes it really easy to drag and drop your apps. You can place them in the right order, add in new tasks from the from the view here. So there are some tasks that are built in. Then you can install extensions into your Azure DevOps instance to get more steps and more tasks to choose from. So the .NET, basically the only tasks that I have here are the .NET tasks, which has different commands that we're running from the dropdown, and then the publish artifact task here that we publish our we build our code, and it's running on a Microsoft hosted runner, Microsoft hosted agent, or even a self-hosted agent. Maybe we want to take that the build output so we could deploy it later. So that's what the publish artifact is doing, is taking that output and publishing it to the pipeline.
Okay.
Cool. All right. So first of all, agent specification or agent pool. So we can, just like GitHub Actions, there are self-hosted runners and GitHub hosted runners. The exact same in Azure DevOps. There are Microsoft hosted agents and self-hosted agents. So they're very if you're kind of building an application and there isn't any on-prem requirements needed, or any connectivity needed, the Microsoft hosted agents are going to work perfectly for that. If you are deploying to a private VNet or private resources or on-prem, for example, then a self-hosted agents are going to be a better pick for you there.
Okay.
So I'm going to use the Microsoft hosted agents because it's very easy to get going, has a ton of software already pre-installed, and there's nothing special really with my app that needs self-hosted runner. So I'm going to pick, because I'm using Microsoft hosted agent, I can pick a few different versions. So I could run this on Windows, Windows 2018, 2022, or even use the Windows latest reference here. That'll just give me the latest version of Windows Windows Server when a new one comes out, or Ubuntu. So I'm going to use the Ubuntu latest because it's a .NET Core app. It builds perfectly fine on Ubuntu.
And this is a web app, so does it really matter what you run it on?
Exactly right. Nope, it doesn't. Ubuntu will work perfect. So Windows or Ubuntu or even Mac would be fine. All right, cool. So you can give your pipeline a name once you pick our name. Because we used a template, it created parameters for us so that we define it essentially it's kind of like a variable, but we define a parameter in one spot, and then it's used later on and throughout the rest of the steps. So you notice that the CS proj is defined here, and then in my steps, I can't even edit the CS proj, the project information here, because it's using the linked parameter. Get back to top. It's using this linked parameter. So if I change it, if I change it here, it would then change down here as well. So it's kind of nice that it has everything kind of built in with those parameters for us. There's a few things we can see from the top view here that might be interesting. So there are variables. So there are some of the pre-built variables for us already that it came with, so like build configuration, build platform, defaulted to release and any CPU. But we could add our own, like if we were deploying, we could add like a web server, add in information here. We could also add in or make this web server password. And then if we scrolled over, we can click the little lock button to make it a secret.
Yeah.
So when I start typing, if I say, this is, password, then it's, obviously it started out, it's asterisk, and it's encrypted so that once we save the pipeline, it's it can't be retrieved. It can't be retrieved in the web. Of course, when you run your pipeline, it's going to have the value for it to connect to your web server, for example. But it's it's kind of locked here and stored here and encrypted.
Cool.
All right, so we have that. We can define our triggers. By default, the continuous integration was disabled, but we can check the box so that, hey, anytime someone pushes a branch or pushes to main, perfect. But maybe we don't want, we don't want the README when someone edits the README. Maybe we don't need to trigger the pipeline, so we can edit a filter here as well.
Okay.
And some of the pull request validation, we could configure that. Why not? And we also could schedule the build. So if you want to run this overnight or every day or something, we can do that as well.
Now, is there a reason that you would necessarily run the pipeline on a pull request? Because after all, it's a request.
Right? Sure. Right. Yeah. Yep.
And I guess the other question is, if I make a pull request into main, is this pipeline going to run on main, even if I haven't changed main? Or can you run it on the branch that you're asking to pull?
Yep, that's good. There's a few things here. So I like to have a pull request validation, or at least of some validation, so that when someone submits a pull request, we have like our build passes and our test passes, and let's say it lints correctly. So we want to make sure that, like, hey, if someone's changing code, we'd want that to we want our build to still work. So yeah, it's going to run. It's in the scenario where someone creates a pull request, and then there's a job that runs to build it, and then when they merge it, you're right. There's going to be another job that then builds it, so it'll be a separate separate job, a separate build. But that's still important, especially when you're working with many different teammates that are on your team working on the same code base. Like your change might build fine in your branch. Once you merge it into the latest main branch, you need to build again to know that, hey, if everything is take this build and have all the changes in it, make sure it still compiles, and go from there.
Okay. So just to clarify, if you run this pipeline on a pull request, is it building main before the pull request happens, or is it building what will happen if the pull request?
Oh, sure. Right. Yep. That's a good point. So it's going to build your branch that you're submitting to the pull request. So basically what this is saying, it's on pull request to main, then it will run the job.
Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So that's
yes, exactly. Yep.
So that would,
if you did like a pull,
that would, sorry, I'm talking over the guest. That would check ahead of time to see if you're doing a pull request for breaking changes.
Exactly. Yep.
Without having to then approve the pull request, find out that it all broke. Okay, perfect. Got it.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. That's exactly it. Nailed it. Yeah, no problem. Awesome. Cool. And there's a few other pieces on options, like you'd have it create a work item on failure, things like that. But let's save it. So let's go back to our task. And yeah, this looks pretty good. Let's save it. We can save it and also save and queue it. So I'll save and queue it, and I can add a comment like initial create and save and run. So cool. Our first pipeline's created, and then we can come in here and click it. We just have the one job then, so we can click on our one job, and we can watch that, watch the interface, kind of go. So we have our one job taking our runner running the job. It's going to do, it's going to clone the repo, of course, check it out. And it's going to run the steps that we put in the order that we put them in based on our template. So very simple: restore, build, test, .NET publish, build. So while this is running, I kind of want to show now. So if I make another, I'll make another quick change here. I can click edit on this pipeline, and then I want to change this to be like, let's say like I change it to like Ubuntu 22.04. So I'll save this again, changing agent. On the history tab, it's kind of neat. So it's not quite YAML again, because this is a classic editor. It's just kind of like stored inside of Azure DevOps. but there still is, we can click on more options and compare difference. So if you're ever into the
Cool.
debugging scenario on, like what changed between different pipeline instances, we could compare the JSON out here and say, hey, it changed from Ubuntu latest to Ubuntu 22.04. So even if you use the classic interface, you still have a lot of the you can still like compare code. It's a little bit messier because it's JSON versus YAML, and it's very explicit JSON. But it's still, still you can look at it. You could also revert this as well. Hey, if pipeline worked here but broke here, let's revert this and go forward.
Okay. So if you can see the JSON, that's a way to import a pipeline from one place to another, presumably.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. If you're maybe changing between different Azure DevOps team projects or something, or different organizations, yeah, you could save the JSON out and then import. There's like a little import pipeline option here that
there you go.
Use to import. Yeah.
Or you can do it as YAML. Either way, got it.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Actually, it's back here for import, but yeah.
Import a pipeline. Perfect.
Perfect. Cool. So yeah, our job finished. It just took a minute and 2 seconds, so very, very quick. It did things. It gave us a nice little summary at the top here that 100% test passed and 1 artifact produced. So very easy to see what happened. Back on the pipeline summary page, again, this is a summary page. So it shows us that the build time, when it happened, what the hash is, what it built and what branch. In the tests, so we can click on the tests tab and see, hey, our 1 unit test passed and great. Once you kind of get more tests out here, it will show you kind of like a trend line as like, hey, your tests are taking longer to pass. So like maybe that's a code smell of like your tests aren't written correctly, or they're just your code base is expanding, so they're not as performant. So we can see our tests, and I changed the drop down to look at pass, as we can see our 1 test here, test 1. Aptly named. And look at our code. If we were publishing code coverage, we could see our code coverage here. My pipeline isn't publishing code coverage, but there is some nice options here for kind of seeing everything in one spot.
Cool.
Awesome. Cool. So this is our pipeline in the classic editor. Now, if we want to go to YAML, or try out YAML at least, we can go. There's a few different ways to do this. You could go to the pipeline view and click here and click export to YAML. So that works. So this will export the entire pipeline to YAML. You could also do that directly from the editor, the classic editor here. So we go to the job. So this is our 1 job here, and click View YAML, and then this gives us a lot of kind of pre-built YAML that we could work with. So I copy that to my clipboard. Now let's try YAML. I know it's a little scary, but it's not too bad. And once more you start working with it, the more familiar it gets, and you might even find you like it better than the classic interface. All right, so let's do it again. Let's do new pipeline. Our code is in GitHub. It's going to redirect me to make sure I'm still logged in to GitHub. Continue. That's the OAuth credential working there. All right, so I can pick my repo again, and we might as well just start with. We could start with starter pipeline. That's fine. So it'll just give us a basic YAML pipeline here that we could take and work with. But let's just try pasting in what we had from the YAML that we exported from the other job and see how that looks. Cool. All right, so let's see. We have our pipeline file, so we notice it's going to save a file in the repo. The file could live anywhere in the repo. It just defaulted to the root. We could have put it or had it placed in like a folder or something, but I think it makes a lot of sense in the root. Like your package.json is probably in the root, and so all your Azure Pipelines file should be in the root as well. It made a few notes that like, hey, this build configuration variable is referenced a few spots. So just let you know to, hey, you maybe want to set that as well. So we have restore projects, and then what it didn't create, because that was again the parameter. It's not really the same concept as parameters in just a regular Azure Pipelines file. So it's just pretty much telling us, hey, we should probably create the build configuration variable here and use that. So we create build configuration, and then we'll call it release. So we have two variables here now with our Azure pipeline pool, and we can just, instead of, we'll do, let's call this not parameters anymore, it's just restore projects, and then all the test projects, and then build the field of build configurations throughout here.
So you imported the YAML from the previous pipeline, but now you're editing it. Right?
Exactly. Yep. It didn't bring in all of the parameters, because like the parameters is not really doesn't have the same kind of concept or mapping in the YAML. So like these parameters here, for example. So we have our projects and then our test projects. So I kind of want to create the same thing here. So we have restore projects, and we have test projects maybe. So I'll add in, I'll paste in the same pattern here.
Got it.
And then we could use just test projects, build configuration. We can just use restore build projects. So then I think we could, I think we're good to save. All right, so I want to talk about a few things here, but let's show a few things. So you'll notice that if I'm typing in the editor, it does kind of give you some help on what are the options for kind of where you're at in the pipeline, which can be helpful. So if you accidentally type out something, like let's say I have a typo there, there's also, actually it's not on this page, I have to save it first from the first time. So let's save this and let's run it. So add Azure pipeline file. I'll push to main branch. And away we go. So if I head back to my my code space, for example, we'll see that, hey, there is a do git pull. Hey, there is a new file here, the Azure Pipelines file. So hey, this is the same exact file that we had before, and or that we're editing just into the Azure DevOps. And if you have the Azure Pipelines VS Code extension, it makes things a little easier for highlighting and some of the IntelliSense features. Go back to my pipeline. So again, same thing. If you you can edit in your VS Code, and if you have the extension, you have that same drop down for help, just like we had inside Azure DevOps. So cool. So let's go back to Azure Pipelines and take a look at our job. It is running. It didn't completely explode after I pasted in and made a few changes, which is nice. And the real test will be if it actually publishes our file correctly. So we'll let this run. While this is running, and we could cancel it, we can see it's running. I want to edit pipeline. I want to show a few more things. So here we go. So we have our steps here, and we're pretty much using the same .NET Core steps throughout. But you notice there's a little settings hyperlink or a little link here on top of each step. So I could click that, and then this will bring me to like what the parameters or options for that individual step that I'm using. So again, it's, even though you're using YAML, there is some assists from the editor that helping you edit the steps. Like how do I know there's a test run title parameter? Like, well, if I click this, and then if I type something here and I click add, it adds in the test run parameter here for us. Okay, but it does help us out a little bit. Something as a pro tip here, and you'd figure this out sooner or later. But if you're using this editor here, and then like you move your cursor because like you want to copy something else. Let's say you want to copy this, then you click add. It's going to add it where your cursor was and what you had selected. So obviously this is broken now. So you just want to be careful when you're using that your cursor is in the right spot and you have the right things highlighted. Cool. But otherwise, I'm able to search the task marketplace or the task list, or scroll through it. So if I wanted to run an Azure or an Azure step, Azure web app step, I could select it and put in some parameters here and inputs. So even though it is fully YAML, there still is a lot of help from
That's
from
nice.
Azure here, from the assistant.
That's
Yes,
cool.
indeed. And then let's say okay, I heard about this jobs thing. Like, how do I do a jobs? So do I just do this? Does this work? I'm not sure. I know there's squiggly, but I'm not sure. So there is a little ellipsis here. You can click more actions. You can click validate, and then this will let you know before you even commit and try to run the pipeline. How's the syntax on your pipeline? So in this case, it tells us on line 10, it's there's something broken here, and between line 9 and line 10, there's a squiggly. So
Okay.
I love to, I don't like to have a ton of littered commits in my repo. So if I usually click the validate button to validate my pipeline. Looks okay, at least from a rendering perspective, before I save it.
And if you're writing your YAML over in GitHub Actions, do you get all of those same things?
You get some of the same things. It'll give you some of the squigglies. Like, hey, if you typo this, it'll give you the squigglies. There is no validate YAML over here, but yeah, it does give you some of the IntelliSense on what it's actually looking for.
So are you saying the Azure DevOps YAML editor is better than the GitHub YAML editor? Is that what you're saying?
There in some cases it is. Some cases it's more user friendly. There's just a different product in general.
Well, that's interesting. So you have complete flexibility. You could do everything in GitHub Actions. You could do everything in Azure DevOps. You could
Exactly.
create GitHub Actions. You run GitHub Actions, but create them in Azure DevOps because it's easier to edit, and then just move the YAML, copy the YAML over, and vice versa. Sweet.
Yep. There's the YAML syntax in GitHub Actions is slightly different, but it follows the same kind of constructs. The main difference is that other than some keywords, there are different. There's no stages concept in GitHub Actions, just jobs. So Azure Pipelines has stages and jobs. GitHub Actions just has jobs, and the jobs depend on each other. So functions are very similar to as a stage, but just some minor differences there.
So our good buddy Janiscu7 asks, is GitHub YAML editor younger than the Azure DevOps YAML editor, or is it vice versa? Are they the same?
Oh yeah, yep. Totally see that. So yeah, the Azure Pipelines has been around for, or Azure DevOps in general has been around for a decade, if longer than that even. So it's obviously just a little bit more mature of a product from the editing perspective, and it just has a little bit more different integrations there.
And a good question from Fala. So you've got project 1, project 2, project 1 test, project 2 test. Does the pipeline build and test all of these sequentially or in parallel?
That's a good question. It's a very good question. So you could do that a couple different ways. You could have that. You could set up your pipeline so that all of your jobs are all of your kind of steps to complete things are in one job. So then the steps inside that job would run sequentially. But if those projects are able to build in parallel, you could define multiple jobs, and then those jobs would run at the same time by default. And you could also even define them as separate jobs, and you can also have the jobs depend on other jobs. So by default, a job in the same stage will run at the same time, so in parallel. But you can have them chain off each other and depend on each other.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, from our pipeline run that we just ran with YAML, it did succeed. So we could verify that it was a YAML pipeline by clicking edit, and it takes us back to our YAML file here. And if you look at our run, the information is very similar to what we had before with our classic editor. It tells us how long it took, or our tests. Our test passed, and that we have a one published artifact here. It published our web app so that we can deploy it. So
the classic ran in a little over a minute, and this one ran in 2:44.
2.5. I think it was sometimes the .NET. It was a restore piece, and sometimes it just takes longer to restore.
Okay.
So you could cache your dependencies so that it's a little bit faster every time if things aren't changing. But yeah, that's
Mhm.
where the difference was. Other than that, it's the same exact. It's running the same exact
Right.
code behind the hood. But it's
Okay.
a good call out because we're demoing. Of course, the .NET restore is taking a little bit longer, but
So but it's not because we did it in YAML
oh,
versus
right.
classic. I just want to make sure
Yeah,
that's the case.
exactly. Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Cool. Awesome. So let's go to let's enhance this just a little bit. So if I click on edit, I want to add in a separate stage so that I can deploy it. So like I very simply could add in my Azure web app task just underneath of everything that we just did here. But it's probably great for testing. But in most scenarios, we're probably going to have a build job run, and then we're going to deploy to dev, and then maybe QA, then maybe prod. And we might need or want approvals along the way. So let's break this out a little bit and let's add some stages and jobs. So because it's not defined, I just have steps here. It just assumes that, hey, we just want one stage and want one job. So now we want to add in additional stages and jobs. So I'm going to go back to Bing here. I like to go to the Azure DevOps YAML syntax page, and schema reference. I'll put this, and we'll put this into the video afterwards. But paste this in. I'm gonna go here, and then this is the page that you want to bookmark, especially if you're working with YAML. This will help you with all the syntax and kind of what are the options and what are some examples, even better of using those options. So we said stages. We want to add some stages. So I'll click on the stages reference here, and it'll give me some information. But I really care about the examples. So hey, okay, it's stages : define the stage, then jobs : define the job. And then this is where that steps keyword is the exact same of what we had before, all of our steps underneath of that. So let's just copy this in. Why not reinvent the wheel? Let's copy this in and get started. Cool. So I'll paste this in. The only thing that we need to do now is just indent our steps so that it's under our job, our build job. Our steps for our build job are under that build job and build stage. All right, cool. So it's no longer squiggling at me. So you notice that I didn't have it correct. It was squiggled a little bit yellow under there. And then now as I tabbed it correctly, now it's no longer squiggly. It's happy.
So in a new tab, is the in the new tab part of the link? Or is it everything?
Oh, did I?
You equal Azure Pipelines.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Oh
I don't
yeah.
know if that's a bad copy and paste or something.
That's okay. I think that. Oh, that's interesting. So if I copy the link, yeah, I think that's my bad. We're learning as we go here. Okay. There it is. So
yeah, perfect.
All right, that's much better.
Yeah, happy. All right, cool.
All right, cool.
So we have our oh yeah, no worries. So yeah, we have our build job and our build stage. So we could have again. So that's back to the question we had before with the test project. So we could have multiple jobs here. So like build job 2, and they would run at the same exact time. When I'm building pipelines, I don't always have multiple jobs inside the same stage, but that's where a job lives, inside of a stage. So we could have multiple jobs in here.
Okay.
But let's get our Azure deployments going. So you add a new stage here, and I just copy and paste it, do the deploy, and I'll call it deploy job, sure. So I don't want condition. I want, I know that I want to run this. So we'll do steps because we know we're going to use steps. But I know there's a type of deployment job that is specifically for deployments so that I can do approvals on it. There's no way to really do approvals on a regular job. I guess unless you're referencing like a service connection or something in Azure. But I want to use a deployment job to know, hey, this is a deployment. So we can look out in look out in the YAML reference page and say, oh, here's the jobs keyword, right? And here's a deployment type job. So it's slightly different than a regular job. It's handled a little bit differently. So here's an example: deploy job, deployment. There's a few extra parameters here on like what the strategy is of that job. So you could for most cases, it won't really matter, but if you're deploying to like a VM or Kubernetes, there's a few other options on like how things, if it's like a VM, a set of VMs, like do we deploy them all at the same time or just run them sequentially. But for our Azure Web App scenario or Azure Web App scenario, we don't really need all that. So let's just simply copy in the example here and paste it over the top. So instead of dash job : deploy, we're going to do dash deployment : deploy.
Now you could build this part of the pipeline using the classic editor, just like you did the build part, right?
Kind of, yes and no.
Kind of?
There is a releases feature inside of Azure DevOps that we haven't talked about a lot. So it kind of follows the same classic interface where if you would link it to a classic build pipeline, and then it's linked to your classic release where you have the editor. But I don't think there's the same level of the pipelines and releases have always been a little bit different in Azure DevOps. So I don't think there's the same export to YAML feature, or at least that's the last time I checked.
Okay.
But once you kind of get the hang of, hey, this is a deployment job, then it's really not that much different than a regular job. So we have the only thing that is different here is that we're specifying deployment instead of dash deployment instead of dash job, and then we're specifying an environment here. So one of the kind of default things that the deployment job does that's different than a regular job is it'll automatically download any artifacts that are published in any prior stages. So we don't have to. We could tell it to if we wanted to be very explicit, but we don't have to because it's just gonna it knows, hey, there's an artifact that was published previously. We probably need that for our deployment in order to take that artifact and deploy it. So it knows that, just it'll download it by default. So you see here I'm using a script action. So you could use a script action as well as instead of tasks. So task in the marketplace or the task list, great. Or if you know the command you want, you can run it with dash script. I had mentioned that before.
Mm-hmm.
All right, cool. So I know we want to add in our Azure Pipeline or Azure Web App deployment. So Azure App Service deployment, cool. And let's just pick an Azure subscription. So if you didn't have a service connection linked, you could click your Azure subscription and it would authorize and it would attempt to create a service principal if you had the right access to a service principal in your Azure Entra environment, your Azure AD. Or you could use an existing service connection that's already been created.
Okay.
So if you have an app ID and client secret that you already have that you want to use as your permissions to deploy to Azure, you can define that under the service connections page under project settings, and then just use that. So there's nothing special. I could just click authorize, and then it'll take a few seconds and try to create that connection for me. But this one already works, so I'm going to select my service connection that's already created. And then it tries to load in the, actually let's try this one. Why is that? Oh, web app on Windows. Yeah, okay. I was going to say, and mine is web app on Linux. That's why I was loading the wrong names there. I was kind of nervous for a second. So let's go back. Web app on Linux. Now, if I click the drop down, cool. Our website is right here.
Yep.
And then it picks it. So we could type it in as well, but it kind of has that nice. It helps you. It knows what it has access to. We could deploy it to a slot if we wanted to, but ours is just a regular or a free web app, so there's no slots in ours. And then this is going to help, or this is going to tell it to where are we going to deploy from. So you might notice there's something funny here. It's system.default working directory. So there are a ton of pre-built in variables or predefined variables in Azure DevOps for both classic and the YAML editors or runtime. So we put this in the chat. But you can look through here of what are all the variables and then what they map to. So in our case, system default working directory. This is gonna default to the spot where the code is checked out to in the S folder, the source folder. But I know from experience that system.default working directory isn't going to work for me. I want pipeline.workspace because this is where the artifact is automatically downloaded to in our deployment job. Just by trial and error is how you learn that, I suppose. So, and if you ever are debugging, because file pathing is the worst piece to figure out in Azure DevOps or just any pipeline editor, really. Instead of let's click off this for a second. So you could have a script task and then just do the ls and dash capital R, and that'll list out the current file system recursively. So this will help you out if you're debugging, where the files or where something was placed. All right, so let's add those changes. Pipeline.workspace, and we'll click add. Cool. And so you notice that because my cursor was in the right spot, it just inserted the YAML for us for this action. There's probably an Azure CLI or Azure PowerShell command that we could have used in order to publish our app to our web service or web app. But the task here makes it a lot easier to use. So there's a bunch of different advanced settings that we could have also used, but I think for now the defaults should be pretty good. We're already specifying which web app and which artifacts to use. So let's click save. We'll update this, add deployment stage. Actually, wait, I want to click the ellipsis. We can now click validate. And cool, everything looks okay.
Good.
So click save, add deployment. Awesome. And we can also run it ourselves manually. Like, when I first save it, I might just be inclined to just click run. But if I'm not mistaken, we already defined our pipeline to run when you push to main, for example.
Right.
So we already added that, so we don't need to run it again. We could, but just run twice. So now our pipeline looks a little different. We don't just have the one job showing here. We have stages and jobs. So before, I think we just saw this with our one job. Now we have stages. So we have our build stage and our deploy stage. So the nice thing about stages is that it kind of is meant to be kind of as like an overall like a border for a particular piece of your pipeline. So they always run sequential. So like build stage was defined first in the file, then that's going to run and complete, and then the deploy stage will run. So they don't run in parallel. Stages don't. They run sequentially unless otherwise defined. Whereas jobs, if they're defined, they'll run in parallel unless otherwise defined to run sequentially.
Okay. So while that's running, a couple questions. It's kind of the same question, just asked a couple different ways. Yeah. Do you recommend combining build and release in a single pipeline?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of like a philosophical question too. It really depends on how you and your team best work. I sometimes like to combine build and release in the same pipeline, and then it just you have one spot to look. Especially with YAML. If you're doing like a classic, they need to be separate in builds and releases. But I have plenty of teams as well that create separate build pipelines and separate deployment pipelines. So they're just completely separate, so that allows them just a little bit more control under when the deploy jobs run.
Okay, and then if you have multiple environments and want to deploy independently, would you use separate build and deploy pipelines?
Sure, yeah. So in that case, I kind of lean towards putting them all in the same pipeline, because then it would nicely show on the graph here, like we'd have deploy dev, then we'd have deploy QA, and then deploy prod. So it's gonna run in order, and it's gonna make sure that it runs in order. So kind of like one of the things that we could do to help maybe improve, like if you kind of are interested in using like a one pipeline with YAML, one of the things that we can do to help improve this a little bit, we can add in conditions. So I have a pre-copied condition here that I'll add in for our deployment job. So I'm going to paste this in. So if you look up in the syntax, the YAML syntax editor, or the syntax reference, you can look at conditions. So I'm going to add a condition to our deploy job, and like maybe I'd call it deployment dev or something. And this is only going to run obviously if the build has succeeded and not equal variables build reason. So the built-in variable of why this build ran, pull request. So basically, if this is a pull request build, kind of like we talked about before, don't run the pipeline. So
Okay.
I can save that in, and this repo is open source, so you're welcome to take this repo and look at my code that we're building in. So I'll put that in here as well. But let's just save this, commit this directly. So we'll go back to our. So this could be helpful too. Is like, so you could also do like build.branch, or I'm sure there's some variable for a branch. It might not be build.branch, but there's should be some variable for branch. And then you could write in like if it doesn't branch doesn't equal main, then don't try to deploy to prod, for example, because we only want prod to come from a main branch.
Right.
Cool. So let's go back to our run here. We see two things that might look alarming at first because we have a big red message here. But basically, it's saying that we're running this pipeline for the first time. We have to give it access to a couple things. First, our environment that we created and defined in our YAML file for approvals. So I'll permit that. Then also our service connection that we're using to deploy to Azure. I'll permit that. Awesome. So that's waiting. I'll let that run. Now that we have our environment, web-dev that we're using, we can go to approvals and checks and add in approvals for it for subsequent runs. So I could add in myself here as an approval. It can't allow approvers to run their own runs or not.
Mm-hmm.
If I add in multiple people, then you have a few more options on like how many people need to be approvals and or approve it and things like that. So
Okay.
it is really nice that once you kind of have that environment, you can define approvals, and then you don't have to be so much concerned about like, this might go to prod. As long as no one approves it, then of course it won't go to prod. Cool.
Okay.
And then it's running our last step here. Successful web app deployment is said in the first try, which is amazing. And it's green because we changed it from gray to green. So it updated, proved it.
Sweet.
Yes.
All right. Here's a question. When are deferred deployments going to be available in YAML pipelines?
Deferred deployments, I know what you mean. So that's a feature in the classic pipelines where you can kind of conditionally approve a pipeline. Like, hey, I approve this a pipeline, but I don't want it to run until 6 p.m. tonight. So yeah, that's not an option in the classic editor, and I don't know if it's ever going to be. Or sorry, in the YAML editor, I don't know if it's ever going to be one. But that is something you could code around. For example, like you could have like a check on your environment or something like that to like hey, don't run it during office hours, and you can even add in. You don't have to code anything. You can add in a check here to say hey, business hours. Just don't run the pipeline. Don't allow the pipeline to be ran. But yeah, it's a little bit different than how the releases function in Azure DevOps for sure.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. So we kind of went through the basic scenario here of hey, we have a pipeline. We have two stages with 2 jobs inside, a build stage and deploy stage. Now we have deploy dev. In theory we'd want to change this to deploy prod. So we'd add in another stage here, deploy prod. And this works. You notice we're already getting close to 100 lines of YAML here. So kind of the next step on kind of taking this YAML pipeline experience and kind of bringing it to an enterprise level is learning about templates. So if we look out here in the Microsoft Docs templates usage with YAML pipelines, templates allow you to kind of define a job once. So like you'll notice that I'll just link in here. You notice that we have our deploy prod is very similar to deploy dev. I just copy and pasted it. So in those cases, this would be a really good example to use a job template to templatize this entire job here, so that every time we deploy to an environment, we're just going to refer to this one template. So that allows us to obviously just update that one template if things change, as opposed to like, oh yeah, we got to change this to 5 and then change this to 5. So we're probably going to forget somewhere. So the templates, the job templates are my favorite way to kind of put all those steps for a particular job in a single spot. Then you can just refer to that YAML file, and everything will be deployed the same way.
Cool. So
Awesome. Yeah.
so there's a question that's going to introduce kind of my summary. Where was it? What do you recommend? Azure Pipeline or GitHub Action
For brand new
project?
Well, as a GitHub employee, I'm probably a little bit biased and say, hey, you should use GitHub Actions, and that's the future. In reality, it is going to be a little bit more of preference on kind of where your code's at today. So if your code's already in Azure DevOps, I can see a very strong case to just using Azure Pipelines. But if your code's, I guess even if your code isn't Azure DevOps, there might be you might want to integrate to GitHub as well, because you want to use the code interface in GitHub and the review features in GitHub. So it kind of really just depends. If you have like an open source project that you want to work on, then I think GitHub is a very, very logical answer for that, because that's for the home of open source. And even if you're a company and you don't have any presence on Azure DevOps or GitHub, I would probably lean towards GitHub in that case, just because it's kind of been known that GitHub is the future. But just like mentioned before, Azure DevOps certainly isn't going anywhere.
And so I guess my question is, for starting out, would you do classic pipelines in Azure DevOps and then use that as a way to get started and learn YAML?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly what I did. The first time I started using YAML pipelines is I built things in the GUI editor, because that was very familiar and very easy to do. And then I exported the YAML, and then just kind of like just became more proficient with YAML over time. And you'll even notice that I don't know all the syntax for the YAML. I've been using Azure Pipelines for like 7-8 years now. I still don't understand all the YAML syntax here and all the syntax just with Classic in general. So I always refer back to the docs. So as long as you know where the docs live, you can be very successful. But I should mention one thing here. If we go back to our search, we search for GitHub Actions Importer. I should mention this. If you do have pipelines that are in Azure DevOps today, and you maybe want to see what they might look like in GitHub Actions, you can run our GitHub Actions Importer on those pipelines. And because it's a very similar team that built Azure Pipelines, built GitHub Actions, a lot of the constructs the same. So they translate very, very not one-to-one, but they're very similar to each other, just some different naming conventions and syntaxes and things like that. But this is a tool that you can run on your both classic and YAML pipelines, and it'll translate and try to convert your pipelines from whatever they are in Azure DevOps, and even releases it'll try to do as well, to the YAML syntax in GitHub Actions. So give this a shot as well if you it can be very helpful for if you're new to Actions, just on how does we have our pipeline in Azure DevOps, and how is it going to look in GitHub Actions. So this tool can be it's very, very useful for that.
Oh, again. Why is it when I paste, it automatically shows in a new tab? I don't get that. Because you know why? Because I'm not copying the link. I apologize, everybody. I apologize for that.
The new tab.
So if I copy it, then it adds in the new tab. But if I copy the link, then okay. Phew. All right. So you can do everything that we just did today using the classic pipeline. You can do CI, you can do the build part, you can do the deploy part.
Correct.
You can do YAML from the get-go in Azure DevOps for sure. And you can, if you're trying to learn YAML, then it makes a huge amount of sense to just do it in Azure DevOps, because even if you're going to wind up doing GitHub Actions, because that's a great way to learn the YAML. And then if you don't want to get overly tripped up by the differences in the YAML syntax, which are not great, but they're there, then you can do the importer.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Exactly. It's perfect. So yeah, you could get it working exactly the way you want in Azure DevOps, and use Ash, and then when you're ready to use GitHub Actions, use the importer. Exactly.
Cool. So that is awesome. So
Hmm.
what do you recommend is basically it all works. It all works great. Um, so choose the way you want to go. If you know
Yeah.
that you're going to wind up in YAML eventually, you may just dive
Mhm.
into YAML and not use the classic and the converter because there's
Right.
nothing like having to write the
Mm.
code yourself to learn how to write the code,
Exactly, right. Yep.
right?
And there's a team like that, for instance, that I just worked with recently, and they have a presence in both Azure DevOps with Azure Pipelines and GitHub now. So like, does everything need to be recreated in GitHub Actions right away? No, probably not. But there are
Hmm.
maybe some like very logical things that make sense as a GitHub action to run. To create a GitHub action, like maybe your security scans because you're just integrated GitHub Advanced Security in GitHub, or like maybe you want to do a lint for a pull request or something. So there's definitely cases for you'll have your full to release pipeline, build and deploy is in Azure Pipeline still, but then you have some, start to build out some of your actions and checks in GitHub Actions as well. So
Hmm.
definitely you definitely can have a dual presence there, and they both can work very very well together.
Cool. All right. One last question before
Mhm.
we wrap
Yeah.
up from Nicaragua. What does
Oh,
the
cool.
remote provider was unable to process the request build error mean in a build pipeline? Have you seen that before?
Do you know where? Did we? I don't know if we saw that remote provider was able to process requests. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not exactly sure where that would be. If it was unable to clone or something. But off the top of my head, I guess I'm not 100% sure.
Okay. So
But
he could
yeah,
DM
just
you and you can chat
oh
further.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah. If you want to reach
Yeah.
out on Twitter, yeah, feel free. My name's on the bottom there, the
Yeah.
side there.
Yeah. So if you didn't
Just
get to your questions or you have questions that you think of, feel free to ping Josh directly.
Yeah, yep. And just as like a debugging scenario, or like debugging, like how to debug just in general, like, I obviously you have your logs out here. Um, so you can like look at your logs. These are just kind of the standard level logs. And then sometimes there are verbose or debug level logs that are helpful. So when you run a pipeline, you have the option to check the box, hey, we want to run this with system diagnostics on. So it'll give you a lot more logging on what's happening. So that can help you track down your problem a little bit easier.
Hmm. All right, cool. Well, thanks so much, Josh. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for doing two of these 2 days in a row.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And thanks everybody for sticking around. And we will see you next time on Visual Studio Toolbox.
See you.